Hi guys, how are you doing? Welcome back to Modern English Grammar. And today we are going to be talking about verb phrases. With respect to verb phrases, there are two very important things that we need to examine. One of them is what we call the verb phrase type. So in every sentence, you're going to have a subject and a verb phrase. And every verb phrase will be one of the following types that we're going to talk about today. So we're going to see that we have multiple classes, different types of verb phrases, and we determine which type a verb phrase is by looking at what is inside the verb phrase. So before we start to talk about the material, I want to just review with you that before you see this video, you should have read chapter 4 from Analyzing Sentences. Don't worry if everything is not crystal clear, because we're going to go through all of the material in that chapter in a lot of detail. So if you have questions, doubts, if you want more examples, please just let me know, okay? So just to remind you, due this Sunday is going to be the 2 assignments about verb phrases. So the first one is verb phrase types. The second is verb phrase structures. And you're welcome to send those to me if you're working on them. If you do a couple, if you want to go through all of them, send them to me and I will take a look and I'll give you comments back. Okay? So today we're going to talk about verb phrase types, and what does that mean? Well, in order to talk about verb phrase types, what we need to first think about is the fact that each sentence is comprised of two things, always, a subject and a predicate. Every single sentence in English has a subject and a predicate. So for example, if you have a sentence like, I slept. So what's going on with that sentence? When we think about the meaning of the sentence, you can see that the topic of the sentence, who the sentence is about, is I. Therefore, I is considered to be the subject of the sentence. So the subject is the topic of the sentence, what the sentence is about. And initially, in English, you're going to find the subject position, because in English we have subject, verb, object, word order. So we expect to find the subject at the beginning of the sentence. So let's take a look at the other part of this sentence. When you have slept, what exactly is this verb doing here? We know that it's a verb because it's showing up with the past tense. Even though it's an irregular, still a past tense, so it must be a verb. It must be a verb. And when we think about what slept is telling us, it's telling us about an action that I engaged in the past. And the past part, of course, comes from this past tense marker. And the meaning of the action of sleeping is coming from the verb itself. So typically, when you have the subject of the sentence, it is going to be the topic of the sentence. It will occur first in the sentence, followed by the predicate of the sentence, which is also always a verb phrase. So a predicate is always a verb phrase. The subject, on the other hand, is always a noun phrase. So we could say that every single sentence in English is going to be made up of first the noun phrase, which will be the subject, what the sentence is about, what information you're going to provide something about. 2, the predicate, which is the same as the verb phrase, which is going to contain the verb and all of the complements of the verb. We're going to talk about what the complements of the verb are in a minute. So the predicate is basically giving you a description of the subject, or telling you something that the subject did, or telling you some information about the subject. So it's a comment on something having to do with the subject. So this is going to be important because when we start looking at the internal structure of the verb phrase, we want to be able to isolate the verb phrase from the rest of the sentence. And what does that mean, the rest of the sentence? It means the subject and the predicate, so the noun phrase from the verb phrase. So for example, if you have something like Mary hit the dog. So the first thing you're going to ask yourself is, okay, who is this sentence about? What are we describing in this sentence? And if we thought about it, we would say, aha, Mary is the individual who this sentence is about. So Mary is the subject of the sentence. And notice that it is a noun phrase, which I'm going to abbreviate with NP. So NP always stands for noun phrase. Why is this a noun phrase? Because it's the subject of the sentence. Every single subject must be a noun phrase, always, always. So taking a look at the rest of the sentence, hit the dog, what's happening here? We have several elements. We have what we know to be a verb, hit, and we know that this is an irregular verb because, for example, you could say Mary hit the dog yesterday. Hit is actually in the past tense. Although we haven't changed the form of the verb, we wouldn't say Mary hitted the dog yesterday, right? So hit doesn't change in its form, but we know the meaning is past tense. We're talking about something that happened before. So this is going to be our verb, and then we want to think about what is this information here doing, the dog. So if we think about this event of Mary hitting the dog, what's going on? Mary is the doer of the action. She's engaging in this action of hitting, and the poor guy that gets hit is the dog. So in other words, the dog receives the action of hitting, and that is what we call the direct object. The direct object is always a noun phrase. So exactly like the subject of the sentence, the direct object is always, always, always going to be a noun phrase. What are the two components of the noun phrase here? The determiner, the, and the noun dog. The is giving you information about dog, so it's modifying dog. It's saying that particular dog that we were talking about, not just any old dog. So together, the verb plus the direct object form the predicate of the sentence. And the predicate of the sentence is exactly the same as the verb phrase of the sentence. So we have a sentence because we have a noun phrase followed by a verb phrase. That will be true for every single sentence that we have in English. Notice that we could have made the sentence more complicated, right? We could have had a subject that was comprised of many more words. So for example, if instead of saying Mary hit the dog, we had something like, the woman who lives up the street and never talks to anyone until you talk to her first, hit the dog. Okay, all of that information that came at the front of the sentence is all pointing to one person. The woman who lives up the street who doesn't talk to anyone until you talk to her first. That's all one individual. So that is the subject of the sentence. That's what the sentence is about. And then when you have hit the dog, it's exactly the same. You're predicating that of that individual. So regardless of how complex a subject might be, it will always be a single unit in the sentence. It will always be the noun phrase subject. And the predicate will always be made up of the main verb plus anything else that you have in the sentence, and that's what we're going to be mainly talking about today. What are those other items that you can have inside the predicate of the sentence, and how do they relate to the meaning of the verb? So keep in mind that when we talk about a noun phrase, we could be talking about a single word, Mary. How do we know that Mary is a phrase? Well, we could do some of the tests, the phrase structure tests, right? So you could say Mary hit the dog, she hit the dog, and she is replacing Mary. So even though Mary is a single word, it is functioning as a phrase here. what else could we do in order to know that this for sure is a phrase? Remember the WH questions? So if you said, who hit the dog, and somebody could give the answer, Mary, they could provide in a sentence fragment, in an answer to a question, just that single word, Mary. That's it. Therefore, we know that Mary is a phrase. Again, this is another way to show to us that Mary is a phrase. So, whenever you're going through any of the structures that we're going to be talking about for the rest of this semester, it's always really helpful to keep in mind that those tests that we talked about at the beginning of the semester, the phrase structure tests, the constituent structure tests, will always work to tell you, regardless of the type of phrase that you have, what are the phrases in your sentence. So you can always do pronominalization, in other words, replacement. You can always do sentence fragments, in other words, WH questions. You can always do clefting, in other words, movement. So in other words, moving something to the front of the sentence. And that will tell you if you have a phrase or not. And now what we're doing is we're saying, okay, given that we have these phrases, we have sentences that are made up of basically a subject and a predicate. What's going on within those phrases? What's happening inside the subjects and inside the verb phrases? So that's what we're going to talk about mainly today, what is going on within the predicate.